So, let me launch into my presentation. It has the intentionally provocative title of Putin has cured me of my pacifism. Now, the quote does not actually come from me. It came from one of my close friends, who is a Mennonite pastor who is serving quite literally on the front line as a chaplain to the Ukrainian military. And this is a quote from him. And a conversation that I had with him last year triggered what, in hindsight, I would now describe as a McClendonian moment. For those who know the theology of James McClendon, and it's actually David McMillan who helped me to see, or to realize in hindsight, that this conversation triggered what became a paradigm shift in my convictional perspective, to use the terminology of IBTS and James McClendon. So I'm going to speak a little bit about this this conversation, the train of thought that this conversation set in motion. But it's not about me and about my convictions. I also want to say something about the challenge of the war, the full-scale Russian invasion, and how this has challenged traditional interpretations of what it means to follow Christ in the midst of a brutal and barbaric war. But just to perhaps lighten things up a bit, I'm going to begin with a terrible joke, if that's okay and if that's appropriate. So the joke is, what is the shortest book in the world? The shortest book in the world is, of course, the Book of Mennonite War Heroes. Now, this is, even in the best of times, this is a terrible joke and not particularly funny. But the thing is, it's become even less funny since the start of the war, of course. And the reason it's become less funny, not just because of the seriousness of the situation, but also because it's not true. Because there are several Mennonite pastors serving as military chaplains on the front line who have done heroic deeds which would fill volumes of enormous books. So there are heroes at work in Ukraine, including many of our closest friends and ministry partners, Mennonites, who are serving as military chaplains with the Ukrainian army. And so this paper, or this presentation, these thoughts have arisen out of a conversation that I had with one such pastor. He's a very close friend of mine, and the last time I met him in person, it was in 2020. He was leading a small congregation of Mennonites in the eastern Dnipro region of Ukraine, which incidentally, by the way, is where my wife comes from. My wife is Ukrainian. She comes from the eastern part of Ukraine between Donetsk and Dnipro, and she also sends her greetings, especially to our Ukrainian brothers and sisters. So this pastor in Dnipro, he was in charge of a small congregation, a Mennonite congregation, and he's now serving as a chaplain in the Ukrainian army. I heard from him just a few days ago. We spoke on the phone. And I always find it amusing when I see my Ukrainian Mennonite friend. He's a Mennonite pastor, but he's clothed in full military fatigues. And it seems somewhat incongruous to me, because I'd always assumed that the Mennonites were pacifists and didn't want to have anything to do with war. And when I challenged him about how he reconciled his service in the Ukrainian military with his Anabaptist Mennonite pacifist leanings, and I spoke to him about pacifism, and he said to me, and I quote directly, he said to me, "Joshua, those beliefs are no longer tenable. Putin has cured me of my pacifism." So that's where the quotation comes from. So my aim in this presentation is not to make moral judgments about the choices that people like Pastor this particular pastor has made. But I want to focus on the way in which the recent experience of war has forced Ukrainian Christians to address questions that had for too long gone unanswered. Questions of war and peace and violence. What does it mean to follow the peaceful way of Christ in the midst of a cruel and barbaric war? And I should say that although I believe strongly that we as Baptists should retain our commitment to peacemaking and reconciliation as the core of our identity, of what it means to be followers of Jesus Christ, I also believe that the traditional position of absolute, unconditional, total pacifism is becoming increasingly untenable. And so my argument in what follows is that this traditional position stands in need of nuance and correction if we want to continue to be faithful to our fundamental calling as Baptists in our obedience to the teachings of Christ. And I'm going to try to illustrate this with examples drawn from Anabaptist history, theology, the witness of Scripture, and of course the lived experience of our Ukrainian friends serving on the front line. So let me just say a few words. This is my friend who's serving as a Mennonite pastor. Some of you, I realise, might be able to recognise him, or you might know who he is. I'm not going to name him, just to maintain the confidentiality. But what I'm arguing is that the current Russian-Ukrainian war serves as a test case for the limits of absolute pacifism. So the current war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine is a clear example of the all-encompassing character of contemporary warfare, in which nuclear-armed powers teeter on the brink of an all-out war, a world war. But even without the looming threat of nuclear weapons, this conflict still involves the mass murder of Ukraine's civilian population. And as a trustee of the charity Dnipro Home Mission, I've had the opportunity to return to Ukraine since the outbreak of the war. We work very closely with local ministry partners in Ukraine, many of whom are serving in Donetsk region, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and we support the churches there. I've been able to view aspects of this terrible war from the perspective of those, such as my Mennonite pastor friends, who are literally on the front line. Now, occasionally, our partners send us photographs and videos. Don't worry, I'm not going to show them here, but they send us videos, photographs of the horrors that they are witnessing firsthand on a daily basis. One of our ministry partners works as a doctor in a field hospital just behind the front lines in the Donetsk region. She's shown us truly horrific pictures of the cruelty of war. And you can perhaps use your imagination when you think about what shards of hot steel can do to human flesh. And so this is the reality that our friends are confronting on a daily basis. One of my pastor friends' responsibilities as a military chaplain is to tend to mortally wounded soldiers, and he told this devastating story about how he was caring for a young soldier, 19 years old, who was literally bleeding to death in his arms. He'd been mortally wounded. There was nothing that anyone could do for him. And this young man, 19 years old, screaming out for his mother the whole time as he bled to death in this pastor's arms. So, really harrowing stories that are coming out of from our friends in Ukraine. Now, you would think that given the horror and the brutality of the war, that it would be absolutely urgent, the absolute imperative to end the hostilities at the earliest opportunity, perhaps even unconditionally, and I can understand that argument. And clearly, it's desirable that there should be peace However, given the current geopolitical situation, we have to ask what peace in Ukraine would actually mean in practice. So we know that Russian political, religious and military leaders have stated their intention to abolish Ukrainian statehood and to force the Ukrainian people to live as vassals under a corrupt tyranny of the Putin regime. So the Russian conditions for peace would result in the annihilation of Ukraine's right, the Ukrainian people's right to exist as an independent nation, to live with some freedom and dignity. Moreover, a unilateral Ukrainian capitulation would create the conditions for further Russian military expansion into other European countries, including NATO-aligned countries, such as Poland, where we are right now, which could lead to a potential nuclear confrontation between Russia and the nations of the West. So, to pray for peace in Ukraine, and this is my argument, and I realize that this has sometimes made me unpopular in some circles and generated some controversy. But I've said to my British Baptist friends, for example, it's great and good to pray for peace in Ukraine. But please realize, don't just pray in an abstract sense for peace in Ukraine. What you're actually praying for, when you pray for peace in Ukraine, you are praying for the collapse of the Russian economy. You're praying for the destruction of Russia's military might and its ability to wage an aggressive war. That's what it means to pray in good faith for peace in Ukraine. That's what peace in Ukraine actually means, to pray for this specific outcome. So, in my view, the Ukrainian army is defending not only Ukrainian territory, but also Christian values of justice and freedom and dignity against the corruption and tyranny of the Russian regime. And speaking to my Mennonite pastor friend, it's obvious what motivates him. He's not motivated by military valor or a sense of conquest or even national greatness. He's motivated much more simply by the desire to care for the soldiers, many of whom he knows personally as friends, and he also wants to protect his family and his community from the Russian soldiers and mercenaries. Russian soldiers and mercenaries who, by the way, have already shown what they are capable of in terms of the indiscriminate murder of civilians, as has taken place in towns such as Bucha, Irpin, and Mariupol, and elsewhere. So a pacifist who takes a position of absolute pacifism by refusing to even contemplate the use of armed force in defense of one's own family, far from contributing to a peaceful resolution of the conflict, this pacifist, despite his or her best intentions, in fact helps to perpetuate and prolong the war, and even to encourage its spread into neighbouring nations. The predominant weakness of the traditional pacifist position is that it fails to distinguish between, on the one hand, malicious wars that are aggressive and enslaving, on the one hand, and on the other hand, defensive wars that are necessary to prevent the further destruction and degradation of innocent life. So you might say, well, this is a total contradiction of the Anabaptist Mennonite vision of the peaceable way of Christ, etc., etc. I want to suggest that the history of Anabaptist Mennonite peace witness is somewhat more nuanced than we might have been led to believe. So the principle that asserts the justification of using violence in order to prevent a greater evil is well established in Anabaptist tradition. Now, in the late 20th century, the influential works of the likes of John Howard Yoder, Stanley Hauerwas and others often skewed perspectives, distorted perspectives on Anabaptist theology, much more towards a position of absolute pacifism. Whereas the historical Anabaptist tradition on the issue of the limited use of lawful violence has been more ambivalent than has often been suggested. The notable Anabaptist historian James M. Steyer argued convincingly that there were notable trends in the early Anabaptist movement that deviated in significant ways from absolute pacifism. And in the earliest Anabaptist communities, there was a disagreement or different perspectives, a kind of split between those who referred to themselves as the Städler, the people of the staff who argued or embraced absolute pacifism, the Städler on the one hand, and the Schwertler, or the people of the sword, to translate it directly, the Schwertler, who acknowledged the right of lawful civic authorities to use limited force to restrain evildoers. Even the Citing Confession of 1527, this remains the definitive summary of Anabaptist beliefs. The Citing Confession acknowledged the legitimacy of what it called the sword as something ordained of God for the punishment, and I quote here, for the punishment of the wicked, even though the sword was seen as being something that lay outside of the perfection of Christ. This was the terminology that was used. And it was only after the tragic debacle of Münster in 1534-35 that the influence of significant later leaders of the Anabaptist movement, such as Menno Simons, began to exert itself. After Menno Simons, absolute pacifism became embedded within Anabaptist thought and practice. But Anabaptists throughout history have argued that the sword has been ordained by God in the unchristian world so that evil might not gain the upper hand. And this is the way that I interpret our moral obligations from within the Anabaptist perspective. That although as Christ's followers we should be engaged with what the early Anabaptists referred to as the order of love, we should not look with condemnation or contempt on those people, be they soldiers or police officers, who act under lawful authority to bridle the hellish impulses of a sin-sick humanity in a sinful world. And so in continuity with Schleitheim, I would claim that all violence, however lawful, lies outside of the perfection of Christ. We might argue that God has established two orders, one being the order of hell, to use the terminology of the early Anabaptists, the order of hell, which God ordains to restrain evil, because the argument was that if hell exists, then it's better that there should be some order brought to it, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, there is the order of love, which God uses to establish his kingdom purposes through the witness of his church. Now, this is an important distinction that, from my perspective at least, is consistent with historical emphases within the Anabaptist tradition. Now, although my Anabaptist Mennonite military chaplain friend is not a theologian of the academic caste, he's not familiar with the nuances of Anabaptist history and theology. My sense from speaking to him was that his implicit theology corresponds closely with the position argued by leading Anabaptist figures, from Balthasar Hubmaier through to Eberhard Arnold. This pastor regards all wars, however noble the cause, as hell. And in fact, he often refers to war as a living hell. So there's absolutely no glorification of war at all in his talk. So he prays for peace every day, and his involvement in the Ukraine-Russian war is to bring order to hell, we might say, by supporting the forces that are seeking to bridle the destructive chaos that has been unleashed upon the people of Ukraine. And his argument is that if the forces of hell threaten him and his family and his church and his nation, then it's better that these forces be restrained by all means possible, even if this involves the use of lethal force. But such lethal force, of course, still lies outside of the perfection of Christ, to use the Citing terminology. So the final question I wanted to address was whether the Anabaptist vision of Nachfolger commits Anabaptists to absolute pacifism. And you'll already have an idea that my answer to this question is no, or at least not necessarily. So my conversations with my Ukrainian Mennonite friends who've chosen to participate actively in the war to support the Ukrainian armed forces, these conversations have led to a Maclendonian paradigm convictional shift in my own thinking about the meanings and implications of what it means to follow Christ, what it means to follow the peaceful way of Christ in the midst of war and in a violent world. Now clearly anyone who claims to follow the way of Christ is called actively to promote the conditions that would lead to justice and peace. Yet, this calling does not necessarily oblige Christ's followers to a position of absolute pacifism. Let me try to unfold the logic a little bit to this position. So, our Anabaptist forebearers understood that following Christ is not a matter of meek submission. Following Christ is a matter of constant struggle. It's that famous first sentence of McClendon, isn't it? Theology is struggle. And the early Anabaptists recognized this. Struggle against powers and principalities. Struggle against the natural impulses that determine the conduct of unregenerated humanity. And part of the genius of the Anabaptist vision, I would contend, is that it recognizes the radical essence of the gospel vision of life lived in obedience to Christ in a way that is fundamentally opposed to human nature. Fundamentally opposed to human nature. And Christian faith, from the perspective of the Anabaptist vision, is not simply a creed that upholds an idea of peace, but it's also a movement of the Spirit that aims to transfigure human nature from the inside out, leading to material changes in circumstances that are conducive to enduring peace. And only such a transfiguration is capable of turning the natural warlike instincts of human nature towards the higher ends of the Spirit that dignify and ennoble our humanity. And this is the condition that leads to sustainable, lasting, enduring peace. Now Baptists, especially Baptists here in Europe, we Baptists, we might say, we generally tend to share with our Anabaptist cousins the conviction concerning the essential fallenness, even depravity, we might not always use that language, but the essential fallenness or sinfulness of the human condition. The world is inherently disordered and corrupted by sin. That's a fairly basic conviction of Baptist theology throughout history. And this disorder and corruption gives rise to selfish ambition and hubris, resulting in violence between individuals and wars between nations. So in such a condition, an ungenerated condition, humanity is ontologically incapable of living in peace, ontologically incapable of living in peace. And this means that war is the normal condition of human beings who live in a Hobbesian state of nature. So it's impossible for a human being in this fallen state to attain to a vision of shalom, of peace, that God intends for humanity, and it's only through the infusion of the grace of God that can transfigure human nature into the divine image and likeness. Now, in the Anabaptist tradition, this infusion of divine grace is expressed in the vision of Nachfolger, Jüngerschaft, or discipleship, obedience, faithfulness to the teachings of Christ. So Nachfolger is not a quality that can be expressed in dogmatic Kantian postulates or categorical imperatives. This vision can only be expressed in the Spirit-empowered discernment. And so any kind of dogmatic postulate, such as absolute pacifism, does not permit this kind of contextual discernment, but subordinates the dynamic gospel vision of justice to an abstract vision of non-violence. And therein lies the problem, at least from my perspective. So, as Baptists, I believe that the concrete, or we believe, that the concrete life and teachings of Jesus, rather than general philosophical principles, should be the object and point of departure for our faith and practice. And according to this conviction of Nachfolge, it may sometimes be tragically necessary to inflict violence, even lethal violence, in order to restrain the forces of hell, as many of our Anabaptist friends in Ukraine have discovered in recent times. So just to conclude with a couple of sentences, what this all means for us today, how we continue to show our support and solidarity with our Ukrainian friends, etc. The Anabaptist vision of the transformation of the character into the likeness of Christ, leading to a healthy and healing unity of humanity and a restoration of God's peaceful purposes in the world, is more imperative now than it ever has been. And ideally, the focus of our witness as Anabaptists, as Baptists, should not merely be on conflict resolution, trying to resolve things once the conflict has already broken out. But instead, the focus should be on proactive measures that help to promote peace and reconciliation, long before there's even been any thought of resorting to armed conflict. The late influential Baptist ethicist Glenn H. Stassen, whose thinking was shaped by his deep engagement with Anabaptist history and theology, Stassen made important contributions to this conflict preventative approach through his work on just peacemaking, which I can highly recommend to you all. So the recent terrible events in Ukraine have reminded us of the dangers inherent whenever nuclear armed states threaten each other with mutually assured destruction. And so it's even more imperative today that we, as the followers of Christ, devote our lives again anew to the coming of the kingdom of God and its peaceable vision of reconciliation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Joshua, a lot. We could do some questions or reactions here, because then we go to listen to the other presentation. But maybe it's good if you want to express your thoughts, your questions, and please do it so that you would come and talk into the microphone. It is much more helpful.
Tony.
Oops.
Well, I'm just curious, Joshua, thank you for your presentation, how your final sentence, that it is imperative that followers of Christ devote their whole lives to the coming of the kingdom of God and its vision of peace, relates to the rest of your presentation, which implies, if I understood it well, that as a Christian nowadays we should at least not distance ourselves for those who take up arms to defend Ukraine. Am I a follower of Christ when I give pressure to my government to give more weapons to Ukraine today? Can you make it a bit more concrete?
Doesn't matter how he responds, you do what you do.
Yeah, thanks, Finn. I do appreciate that there may appear to be a certain paradox, perhaps even a contradiction in what I was trying to say. But I'm not really surprised by that. First of all, because I'm still wrestling through these issues myself, and this is giving me an opportunity to express these thoughts out loud. I'm not trying to present a dogmatic position for everyone to follow. I'm not trying to be prescriptive here. And it's a little bit like Helen reminded us this morning, that there are no simple answers. There are no simple ways towards peace and reconciliation, but we have to keep wrestling and struggling with these questions. So what I would say in response to the question about whether there's a contradiction is that yes, perhaps there is, but the Christian ethical life is necessarily lived in paradox and in the tension. So I want to maintain that tension quite intentionally, because I recognize that there are no simple black, white, clear responses to these enormously difficult ethical challenges. And in making my argument, I wanted to maintaining my argument against the traditional position of absolute pacifism, I didn't want to entirely lose the hope that there is still something that is valid in the traditional pacifist position. So by all means, I would want to encourage Christians, in whether they be in Ukraine, in Germany, in Poland, in the UK, in the Netherlands, to continue to support and hold Ukraine, the Ukrainian people, in our thoughts, in our prayers, to continue to campaign for justice and peace on the concrete question of, they call it Waffenlieferung in Germany. What do they call it? Supplies of weapons, weapon supplies. On that concrete question, I don't have any particular wisdom to offer. These are questions that rightly have to be discussed and decided by people who are responsible for these things. But what I'd say to you quite concretely and personally is that I think that it is right and just for countries like America, UK, to supply Ukraine with the defensive weapons it needs, the weapons that it needs to defend its people, to maintain the lives and the freedom and the dignity of its people against a war that is internationally recognized as a grievous breach of international law, an illegal war of occupation. And what I'd also say, to answer your question quite concretely, there was a debate recently about whether America should supply Patriot air interception missiles to Ukraine. Now personally, I can't even see why an absolute pacifist would object to this, because what the Patriot missile system does, it simply intercepts missiles in midair. And even when they intercept the missiles, no human being is damaged or killed. There's no violence against another human being inflicted with the deployment of that weapon. So I couldn't really see, even from a principled position of absolute pacifism, why anyone would object to giving Ukraine the ability to intercept deadly missiles that are intent on wiping out civilian populations in large cities. My wife's city in Dnipro, where she's from, it was just in January earlier this year. It was terrible. Just a few hundred meters from where my brother-in-law lives with his family. A Russian missile that was intended to take out battleships and aircraft carriers landed on an apartment block in the middle of Dnipro city. This was at the time when there was still a debate raging about whether Ukraine should receive these anti-missile interception systems. And perhaps if those ethical questions had been resolved sooner and the aircraft system, the anti-missile system had arrived on time, then that missile could have been intercepted, many lives could have been saved. So I understand and I even respect the motivations of those who speak to this issue from the perspective of absolute pacifism. I can understand that, and I can even respect that. But I can't understand what objection could be made, even from this position, concerning the delivery of arms and munitions that are intended to inflict violence, not against persons, against human beings, but against deadly missile systems. So that's something that I do struggle with a little bit. But just to come back to the original point, I think that this whole debate, despite the moral clarity of what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, whenever you debate the ethics and you debate the positions from a principled, convictional perspective, there are always inevitably tensions and paradoxes, and we just have to be open to that, be open to the leading of the Spirit as we try to find Christ-like solutions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Joshua, is this on? Yeah. Thank you very much. Thought-provoking in a situation where we're all struggling, really. But you seem to be dependent on quite a closely drawn dualism. You know, the hell and how does that belong with a kind of theology of the kingdom, which is obviously beyond the church, where God is building His kingdom? And in relationship to that, you also said, drawing on the Anabaptist concern for discipleship, if somebody who wants to follow Christ reads the Sermon on the Mount, and particularly the end of Matthew chapter 5, what do you think they should make of that when it comes to this question of pacifism and war?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I'm just going to make a note. So your first question was about the dualism, the second about the Sermon on the Mount and the challenges of taking seriously, perhaps even taking literally what Jesus said about loving your enemies, etc. Let me try to answer the first question. So I take the point that there is clearly a dualism in the way that the issues are presented, not just in our theology, but also sometimes in the media, and sometimes we need to take a more diplomatic and nuanced perspective on the issues. That I can understand and can sympathize with. But viewing the issue from a theological perspective, from the perspective of Anabaptist history and theology, my understanding of Anabaptist theology is that it's absolutely shot through with these kinds of dualisms, these separations between the church and the world, between the state and the church, between the gospel and the law, etc. These are all clear dualisms, and to some extent this mirrors the dualistic worldview that we see in the scriptures, particularly in the writings of the Apostle Paul, where there are often distinctions that are made between the flesh and the spirit, between light and darkness. You go to the book of Revelation, and again you see very clear distinctions. The lines between good and evil are very clearly delineated. So I think that we can't get away from the fact that this is a recurring feature of not just Anabaptist history and theology, but also of the the testimony of scriptures, the testimony of Scripture itself. On the question concerning the Sermon on the Mount and how the sermon would be a challenge to, for example, these Anabaptist Mennonite ministers who are serving on the front line, they would say that they are still acting in obedience to the teachings of Christ because they themselves are not carrying weapons, they're not inflicting violence themselves, but they are supporting and providing soul care to the soldiers who are having to take on this burden, this responsibility themselves, and they support them unequivocally as they carry out this duty which they regard as necessary and appropriate. The challenge of the Sermon on the Mount is always, we've been arguing about this as Baptists, Anabaptists for at least 500 years, about how best to interpret the Sermon on the Mount. So is the Sermon on the Mount law or is it gospel? How do we interpret the words of Christ? And I think the worst thing we can do as Baptists, as Christians, is to take the life-giving words of Christ and turn them into soul-crushing laws which prescribe and dictate conduct. I think we need to be much more open to the leading of the Spirit, to identify the Sermon on the Mount within the context of the freedom of the gospel, which doesn't prescribe or regiment certain behaviours, but which offers the ethical parameters within which we make moral judgments. But again, it's complicated because Jesus didn't, it's precisely because Jesus didn't give us a prescribed list of dogmatic postulates. We sometimes dress Jesus in the clothes of an 18th century rationalist philosopher, and Jesus ends up sounding a lot like Immanuel Kant, spouting out dogmatic postulates and categorical imperatives, but that's not the way that Jesus engages with us in his ethical teachings. Instead, he unveils a vision of what life is like in the kingdom of God. And I think we just have to acknowledge that and to understand the importance of discernment, applying Spirit-led judgment in specific contexts rather than trying to arrive at easy solutions or dogmatic answers.
Thank you.
But thank you.
Thank you, Josh. I just would like to say a comment that when you look on the life of Jesus, the first time when Jesus came to the earth, he was more like a pacifist. But the second time when he will come, he will be definitely military. Thank you.
Yes.
Discuss.
Discuss, yes.
That's dualistic.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joshua. I just want to add a comment. According to our reporters, the first level medical clinics closest to the front line, they have no problem in treating Russian soldiers. They do that. And I think that's very Anabaptist and Baptist and Christian. That's what the reports carry. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you also very much for the presentation. My main question is, maybe we should rethink or try to redefine what is war after all. Because we're talking about something we don't know anymore. Geneva Conventions are out. Because there's hybrid war, there's cyber war, there's terrorist war, all sorts of things, and this kind of old logic is over.
Yeah.
And now my main question is, you bring us back to this use in bello idea, this just war. We need to be just in our war, if I get you right. If Putin is combatant because he's a chief army leader now, he's making decisions, then according to international law, he could be taken down. We could shoot him down because he's competent. How far you would go? Would you go with Bonhoeffer taking Hitler down? If you would be military, how far you would go with your use in bellow, defending innocent Ukrainians, let's say?
Yeah, thank you for the comments and also for the question. It's a good question and it's a fair question. It's also quite an invidious question because the way I answer it could be misconstrued, misinterpreted. Let me try to explain where I'm coming from. Firstly, I have not tried to make a case for just war theory in the presentation that I've just given. In fact, just war theory would be another dogmatic approach to this issue, which I'm trying to avoid. What I'm trying to say is that there needs to be, we need to apply spirit-filled discernment to specific contexts and situations in order to respond in a Christ-like, spirit-filled way to particular ethical dilemmas. You're asking me personally what I would do if I would follow Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I can't say that I would go that far. What I can say is that that wouldn't be my decision to make. That even lies far outside of my ethical competence to even make a judgment on that. But there are people in Russia, Christians in Russia, who would be able to make that sort of ethical judgment and arrive at appropriate ethical conclusions, taking into account everything that I've said about the imperative to uphold justice and to uphold the dignity and freedom of human beings. Perhaps this end could be better served, not by political assassination, but what I would hope for would be something more like a popular uprising in which the war criminals, the people that you have named, would receive justice. And by justice, I don't mean political assassination, I mean that they would stand trial in a court of law and receive a fair trial. I think that would correspond. I think that would correspond more closely to a Christian conception of justice, at least from my perspective. But just to clarify, I'm not making a case for just war theory in the presentation, because we know throughout history that just war principles, although in theory it's intended to avoid war, in reality it's provided post factum justification for the waging of aggressive wars. So I want to steer clear of absolute pacifism on the one hand, and also just war theory on the other hand. I think there is a via tertia. I think there is a narrow path that lies between those two invidious alternatives, and that way I would describe as the way of discipleship, the way of spirit-led discernment, obedience to the teachings of Jesus Christ.
Thank you.